Diabetes and intermittent fasting. Do they go together? Is it a good idea? Are there some diabetics that shouldn't do it? And are there some that definitely should? Well, we need to understand that there's different types of fasting and there's different types of diabetics. So today we're going to talk about that and explore it so that you understand when it could be appropriate so that you can help yourself and maybe guide some others as well. Coming right up. I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you'd like to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So diabetes is a disease of blood sugar issues. It's a disease where blood sugar runs high, and untreated it runs so high that it spills over in the urine and it starts destroying the kidneys, and both high and low blood sugar can be very dangerous. What's the difference between a type 1 and a type 2 diabetic? Well, when we look at blood sugar, both a type 2 and a type 1 are characterized by high blood sugar. That's what they have in common. The difference, though, is a type 2 diabetic generally develops it gradually. It's an overload on the system. It's abusing the carbohydrate tolerance machine over a period of decades, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, until finally it just says, I can't do it anymore, and it has no ability to control the blood sugar, and the blood sugar goes high. That's a type 2 diabetic. A type 1 diabetic is someone who rather suddenly loses the ability to make insulin at all. It's a pancreas problem. It's a destruction of the pancreas. And typically it is an autoimmune process or an infection of some sort that takes out the pancreas, the beta cells, oftentimes very, very quickly in a matter of days or weeks. The high blood sugar in type 1 diabetics, it typically happens very, very fast. A type 2 diabetic, a lot of these people are undiagnosed because if they don't go check for it, they may not know. A type 1 diabetic will typically always know very quickly because they get very, very sick. No matter how much they eat, they can't gain any weight. They can't use any glucose because there is no insulin to help the glucose out of the blood and into the cells. So all the sugar is being pushed out through the kidneys and lost in the urine. So doesn't matter how much they eat. It's called the starvation in the midst of plenty. Even though they both have high blood sugar, the development is quite different. And type 2 diabetics may or may not know that they have it. Type 1 diabetics typically know that they have it. Insulin is very high in a type 2 diabetic because they have pushed the insulin production over a long period of time, but they can still make insulin. Their pancreas is perfectly capable to make insulin, even though in some cases the system, their bodies, their health can be in such poor shape that the type 2 turns into a type 1, that they can actually have pancreas destruction because it's just so worn out and weak that you can start getting autoimmune attacks as a result of the pancreas not working, and type 2 turns into type 1. But for the most part, type 2s have a highly functioning pancreas. They can make lots and lots of insulin, but the insulin still isn't enough to control the blood sugar. In type 1s, they have zero insulin. That's the criteria, that's how they diagnose it. They do a fasting insulin test, and if it's below detectable levels, then they're diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. So they have no insulin. So in that regard, they are complete opposites. For the longest time, they didn't know this, that when you look back in the history, hundreds or thousands of years, then what they talked about was type 1 diabetics. Those were people that for some reason had their pancreas destroyed. And type 2 diabetes was basically non-existent because it took a lot of sugar and a lot of carbs and processed grains and abundance of food really to develop type 2 diabetes. Today, we have probably 25-30 times more people with type 2 diabetes than type 1 diabetes, but both of them are on the rise. This one is growing steadily, this one is growing exponentially. If they're both growing, then there's probably something to do with lifestyle, because our genes don't change that fast. So we have everything to gain by learning how to manage these the best. When we look at insulin resistance, a type 2 diabetic has, like we said, very high insulin resistance, because we have created a very high insulin level for a long period of time, and now the cells become resistant. And we've got lots of videos on those topics if you want to check out a more detailed explanation on that. A type 1, however, they can kind of be either or. In the beginning, they are usually very insulin sensitive, because there was nothing wrong until their pancreas got destroyed, and then they had no insulin. So now the body is screaming for insulin because there isn't any. So they are super insulin sensitive in the beginning, and then they discover that they're type 1 diabetics, and now they start injecting insulin. So now if they stay insulin sensitive or if they become insulin resistant depends on how much carbs and how much sugar and how much processed foods they eat. So some people believe that, oh, just eat whatever you want and just inject enough insulin to control the blood sugar. And that's sort of, unfortunately, the standard of care for type 1 diabetics a lot of times. The standard recommended diet for healthy people in this country is about 300 grams of carbohydrate. And if we count in the fruits and the dairy products and the refined sugar, even staying within the recommended guidelines, you can still eat 150 grams of sugar per day and eat the recommended food. If you eat like that, then the low insulin resistance will turn into significant insulin resistance. So even if you're type 1 and you're having to inject that insulin from the outside, you can become insulin resistant by following the diet that turned the type 2 diabetics into type 2 diabetics, that turned them insulin resistant. So where does intermittent fasting fit into this? Well, it's all about insulin. So the foods that stimulate the most insulin are sugar and refined carbs. So the more of those foods you eat, the more insulin you stimulate. So the whole idea with low carb and keto is to eat less of the foods that stimulate insulin so that you can reverse insulin resistance and become insulin sensitive and help the body burn off the fuel and find blood sugar balance again. And if low carb and keto work, then fasting is going to work even better, even faster, because when you're fasting, you're not eating anything. Then your carb intake is zero. The low carb, the keto, and the fasting, they're good tools to reduce the insulin response. So let's look at a few scenarios here who might be a good candidate or not so great candidate for intermittent fasting and or low carb. So if we take a type 2 diabetics who are not on any medication, they've just driven up their blood sugar, but they haven't gotten to the point where they haven't started or accepted any medication yet, these people are the prime candidates for intermittent fasting. If you want to do low carb or keto first, great, but if you don't want to, just go straight for intermittent fasting, because it's going to be the fastest, most powerful way to start bringing that insulin down and reversing this disease. There are very few drawbacks, if any, so just learn more about the different patterns, try the different kinds, the different timing, and just see what works for you and what gets the results that you want. If you are a type 2 diabetic and you're taking metformin or some similar drug, then you're still pretty safe. You are a great candidate. There is a risk for complication though if you all of a sudden take all the carbs out of your diet and you keep the same level of medication, it probably won't happen super fast, but there's a chance that that medication can drive your blood sugar too low, too suddenly. So you want to monitor very, very carefully. Monitor your glucose levels and watch it very closely. And probably it's a good idea also to consult your doctor so that he knows what you're doing and you can talk about how much metformin to take and so forth. If you're type 2 diabetic on metformin and or insulin, and you're actually on insulin, then I would strongly recommend that you talk to your medical doctor and you talk about how to dose this insulin, because there are concerns with hypoglycemia. That's basically what's going to happen. If you are on a certain level of carbs and a certain level of insulin, and then you cut out all the carbs, now you are over-medicated, and there's a good chance that you're going to push that blood sugar too low and develop hypoglycemia. So some people say, oh, well, that's a reason that you should never do intermittent fasting as a diabetic. But if the insulin is only there to handle the carbs that you're eating, then if you reduce the carbs, why not just reduce the insulin? The only trick is that you have to be careful and match it and monitor it very carefully. If you are a type 1 diabetic, that means you are on insulin, and you are insulin sensitive, meaning that it's well managed, that you're probably not eating a ton of carbohydrate, then there's not too much reason for you to change anything. Depending though on how much insulin are you taking, because it can still be beneficial to reduce the insulin, and we'll talk more about that. So this would be the only candidate out of these who really wouldn't be a great or an obvious candidate for intermittent fasting. But if you're a type 1 diabetic who has eaten lots of carbs and your insulin dose has been going up over time, then you would still be a great candidate for intermittent fasting. If you want to start slower and just go to low carb and keto gradually, then it would be much easier for you to figure out to gradually change your medication. But realize that as soon as you cut back on your carbs, you are over-medicated. You have to change both of them and match them together. You have to change the food, the carb intake, and the insulin dose at the same time. But look here at why you would want to do that. Because both blood sugar and insulin are very destructive. They're both very damaging. A lot of the complications of insulin resistance and diabetes, such as blindness and kidney failure and cardiovascular disease and obesity, they have to do both with glucose, with blood sugar, and insulin resistance. So if you can reduce the amount of insulin it takes to get the job done, then you're that much better off. So if you're eating the recommended 300 grams of carbs and you're taking the corresponding amount of insulin, but then you figure out a diet that works for you where you can eat 100 grams, then you should be able to get by on a third of the insulin. You can get down to cut it down by 2/3. And probably you could cut it down even more, because if you do any form of exercise, if you go walking once in a while, then you need even less insulin. The muscles become much more sensitive to the insulin when you're exercising. And if you went from 300 down to 60 grams, now you could get by on 1/5, on 20% of the original insulin. If you get down to 30 grams, you could get by on 1/10. So it's not just a cost savings, but it's a health savings primarily. So most of the complications for both type 2 and type 1 diabetics is because they're really mismanaged. They're not doing what they need to bring the insulin down. And the goal is to get the job done with the least amount of insulin. You're eating certain amount of calories, you're eating a certain amount of food to fuel your body and to rebuild your body. And you need to take some, as a type 1, you need to take some insulin to move that food from the bloodstream into the cells. But the less insulin you can take to get the job done, the better off you are. And a lot of this has to do, the reason a lot of this becomes difficult is because of blood sugar swings. And the more sugar and the more carbs you eat, the more blood sugar swings you're going to have. The best blood sugar levels you're going to get when you're fat adapted. When you're in ketosis, because now you have very, very few blood sugar swings, your body has learned to depend on fat and ketones for fuel. So because you depend less on glucose, not only do you need less insulin, but you're going to have much less swings. So that's going to make it much easier in the long run to dose and reduce that insulin. So the overall goals that you want to think about is you want to lower your A1C and you want to lower your insulin resistance. So for the type 2 diabetic, it means get off the insulin, and then as long as your pancreas is working, you want to have it make less insulin. So that again means low carb diet, maybe intermittent fasting. And for the type 1 diabetic, that means you're still going to be taking insulin for the rest of your life, probably, but if you can inject less, then you're going to be that much healthier. So there are a lot of people, diabetics and non-diabetics, who can benefit from low carb and intermittent fasting that can make their bodies more insulin sensitive. So learn as much as you can, watch my other videos on the topic, and see how it could work for you. Learn enough that you can do it safely, and then consult with your doctor so that you can get some good guidance in monitoring and measuring and regulating if you're on some medication. Please leave your comments below if you have any questions. I'd love to see those. And if you have any good stories or any experiences, that'd be great as well. If you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. And please share this video because insulin resistance and diabetes is the fastest growing epidemic of our time. And if we don't get it under control, it's going to be even more of a disaster than it already is. Thanks for watching.